So, good morning, all. So, I will be talking about IVF in medically complicated patients. So, we will be covering through all the comorbid conditions of patients, and there are about infections and other conditions like APLA, SLE will be separately dealt. So, this topic is mainly to touch about all the comorbid conditions and grossly how we are going to manage it. So whenever you see a patient with comorbid conditions, we have to have an individual risk assessment. So the question needs to be asked whether IVF is safe in this patient. Is pregnancy safe, be it for mother, for the child? Will this disorder reduce her chances of pregnancy? There should be an individual risk assessment, a proper fitness from physician, multidisciplinary approach might be required. You need to have a detailed counseling with the patients regarding the probable complications during the treatment, and you should obtain a prior informed consent. So the common disorders of young women which can lead to subfertility, the comorbid conditions are cancer and its late effects, chronic infections like HIV, HBs, AG, HCV, endocrinopathies like diabetes, thyroid and prolactin disorders, hematological conditions, autoimmune disorders, renal failure, central nervous system disorders like psychiatric and seizure disorders, cardiovascular like hypertension and valvular disorders, respiratory system like asthma, COPD, and obesity. So coming to a comorbid condition, that is cancer. So what happens to fertility after cancer treatment? Is it possible for us to preserve fertility before cancer treatment? And will fertility recover after a cancer treatment? So, how will the fertility be affected in a cancer patient? So, that depends upon the age of the patient, the type and stage of cancer which is being treated, the drugs which we are using to treat the cancer, the method of its administration, the size and location of radiation field if it is planned, and the selected dose intensity of the radiation regimen. So, all these factors influence whether the fertility is going to get affected and if it is affected to what extent. So the incidence of permanent ovarian failure following a cyclophosphamide therapy is about 13% for young patients as less than 20 years, 30 to 50% in patients around 20 years of age. And if the patient is more than 30 years, then almost 100% chance of permanent ovarian failure. So these things has to be kept in mind before. That is the reason we should offer fertility preservation for these patients before we go ahead with a chemotherapy or radiation therapy. So the rates will be higher after a high dose rescue chemotherapy and after pelvic radiotherapy. However, there are newer chemotherapy regimens called ABVD regimen for breast cancers, which are less gonadotrophic, and there is less chances of permanent ovarian failure when we are using such regimens. So the algorithm for fertility preservation for patients who are having cancer, if it is diagnosed pre-pubertally, then best is to go ahead with ovarian tissue cryopreservation, because ovarian stimulation is not possible for these patients as they have not attained menarche. And for patients who are post-menarche, whether we have to assess whether the patient is having time for ovarian stimulation, whether we are getting those 15-20 days for ovarian stimulation, and if that time is there, if the patient is married, we can go ahead with the IVF with husband sperms and do an embryo cryopreservation. If the patient is not married, then we can obtain the semen sample source either from a donor or a potential partner and do the ICSI process and do the embryo cryopreservation. If there is no partner or a donor semen source which is not acceptable for patient, then it's best to go ahead with oocyte cryopreservation. And if we don't have any time for ovarian stimulation, then best, if the patient is having fitness for surgery, then go ahead with ovarian tissue cryopreservation, or at least if few days are there, we can go ahead with retrieval of immature oocytes and doing an IVM process on them. So who are the ideal candidates for ovarian tissue freezing? It should be offered for women whose chance of spontaneous pregnancy is low. or nil in their late teens or early 20s whose cancer is not likely to encompass the ovarian tissue metastasis. So this should be kept in mind. The patient should not have any ovarian metastasis and her general health condition should be such that it should permit the surgery. So this is offered for patients who are prepubertal and early 20s. And emergency IVF procedure can be offered if there is at least 20-day interval between the IVF stimulation and the chemotherapy. So this is most often the conventional treatment which is offered for most patients. IVM is offered if the patient is not having sufficient number of times or the patient is having a polycystic ovarian syndrome where too many follicles, the possibility is there. So in such a case, we can offer them IVM and retrieve the immature oocytes and then go ahead with the in vitro maturation process. However, because of the prolonged culture in the in vitro state, there is a chance of imprinting disorders. So the other method is to give GnRH agonist in order to suppress the ovaries. So whenever a GnRH agonist is given, it suppresses the ovary by decreasing the blood supply. But however, the concern is that so that chemotherapy, the chances of the chemotherapy affecting the gonads will also decrease. But however, there is a chance that in cases of breast cancer and all, it also can reduce the tumor sensitivity to the chemotherapy and thereby decrease the chances of cure in such patients who are suffering from breast cancer. So this is something which can be just considered based on the time availability and all, and the general fitness of the patient. So these are the 4 fertility preservation options which are available for patients who are suffering from cancer. So the drawbacks of fertility preservation is that you are delaying the initiation of cancer treatment and you are elevating the estradiol concentration, especially in an IVF stimulation or in IVM. And we are aware that most breast cancers in young women are estrogen receptor positive. So there are concerns about the proliferation of the cancer cells in breast tissues. So what is the answer for that? It's best to use aromatase inhibitors for stimulation, which have an effect of decreasing the estrogen in the periphery. Tamoxifen, which has an anti-estrogenic effect on the breast, using low-dose gonadotropins in order to decrease the chances of elevation of estrogen. But however, is transient elevation of plasma estradiol really harmful? So the debate continues. So how we plan ovarian stimulation for patients who are suffering from cancer? The idea is to do a minimal stimulation and also keep her estrogen levels low so that estrogen receptor positive breast cancers are not much subjected to the chances of proliferation. So we start Letroz 5 milligram daily from the starting day of stimulation and it is continued till before oocyte retrieval. So this helps us to stimulate the ovaries also and also keep the estrogen low. And from day 5, we start with the gonadotropins, FSH or HMG, starting with 150 to 225, depending upon the age, AFC, and weight of the patient. Antagonist is used to prevent LH surge, and always agonist triggers are preferred, even if your estrogen levels are low. That's because HCG again has an effect on the coagulation cascade. So in order to prevent any sort of unnecessary thromboembolic episodes, agonist trigger will be preferred. And after the oocyte retrieval, we continue Letroz for some more days till the patient achieves the estrogen concentrations of less than 50. So what are the results of this kind of protocols? Yes, these patients do have less estrogen levels, but you can compare a similar estrogen oocyte yield as compared with the conventional antagonist protocol. So this is the protocol used for breast cancer or cancer endometriomas, where we use Letroz for about 10 to 12 days, 5 milligram per day, FSH or HMG depending upon the body weight and AFC of patient. Antagonist is used to prevent premature LH surge. Preferably, agonist trigger should be given and Letroz is restarted post pickup in order to reduce the estrogen levels. How will be the response of ovarian stimulation in cancer patients? So these cancer patients, we know there will be a drastic weight loss in these patients, which can affect the hypothalamo-pituitary axis, which can reduce their reproductive capabilities. The psychological stress can lead to increase in prolactin and endogenous opioids, which can again affect the response to ovarian stimulation. A recent meta analysis has concluded that cancer women who are undergoing COS, in order to maintain their fertility, they produce fewer oocytes when compared to their healthy counterparts of the same age. And others have also found a longer stimulation duration of stimulation for COS and a higher gonadotropin requirement in cancer patients. And there is an association of BRCA1 mutations with occult primary ovarian insufficiency is the possible explanation for link between infertility and breast ovarian cancer. So what is the stimulation, ovarian stimulation, safe for an estrogen receptor positive breast cancer patients? So this article published in Fertile Sterility in 2012, it concluded that FSH, LH or HCG, they do not have any effect on, they do not actually cause any increase in cell proliferation of the tissues which are malignant. The potential risk of memory cell transformation associated with these agents may be an indirect related to an indirect endocrinological effect on the breast cell physiology. So as such, there is no direct effect of these gonadotropins on the breast cell proliferation, and hence it is considered safe to do a IVF stimulation for ER positive patients. However, taking all precautions in order to keep the estrogen levels as low as possible. So there has been no convincing evidence which was found that it increases the ovarian stimulation increases the risk of invasive ovarian tumors with fertility drug treatment. However, there is a chance, there is an increased risk of borderline ovarian tumors in subfertile women treated with IVF. So how will be pregnancy after a cancer treatment? Children born through these cryopreserved embryos are healthy. There is low chance of long-term damage to uterine function after chemotherapy. However, if there is an abdominal radiotherapy given, there is an increased chance of miscarriage, premature birth, low birth weight, and these effects are seen maximal if the radiation was given prepubertally. Coming to other comorbidities, that is the infections and its association with infertility. So commonly we screen patients for HIV, hepatitis B, C, and syphilis, and tuberculosis also. So these are some of the associated infections which can affect the fertility, and also it will be challenging for us to do ERT in such patients. Coming to HIV, over 17 million women are living with HIV worldwide. Most of them are diagnosed in their reproductive age group, and many women wish to have children in spite of being positive. And tubal status is the most common cause of their infertility in HIV infected women. Untreated and unattended seropositive women may actually transmit the virus to their partner and child. So it is our responsible to prevent the transmission to the partner and vertical transmission. So the ART technology should never be denied for any HIV positive couples just because of their seropositive status. So the risk of HIV transmission from one uninfected partner to an infected to uninfected partner is about 1 in 500 to 1000 episodes of unprotected intercourse. So the transmission risk is quite low only. However, if the patient is on a hard treatment, then definitely, and those who are having undetectable virospermia, the chances of transmission is further reduced. So in all HIV positive couples, preconceptional counseling is very important for them to understand the nature of the disease. The psychological counseling should be offered in order to cope up with a child where one parent is HIV positive, the possibility of single parenting in future, that sperm washing will actually not cause complete reduction in the chances of transmission, and the virus could be still present in the aliquot of the semen prepared. What is the risk associated with unprotected intercourse? The possibility of adoption. We should use barrier even if both the couples are seropositive in order to prevent infection from other stains. Abandoning any practices that can lacerate the sexual practices which can lacerate mucosal surfaces. Folic acid should be started, and there should be strategies to decrease vertical transmission from mother to child. And we should avoid medications which are contraindicated in pregnancy, like efavirenz. So, what are the fertility options for HIV positive females? So, if the wife is positive and husband is negative, then if they are not having any subfertility or infertility, the semen can be collected into a condom which does not have any spermicidal, and it can be just instilled into the vagina without any washing. Or if the patient is, if the woman is already on heart and she is having very low viremia, then definitely a direct sexual contact with post-exposure prophylaxis to man can be considered. So the other option in a serodiscordant couple is the patient, if the husband is positive, then we can offer artificial insemination donor in order to completely neutralize the chances of transmission. There are two approaches, European approach and American approach. European approach endorses IUI treatment where sperm washing will be done. The aliquot of sperm will be tested for the HIV PCR, and then IUI will be done. Whereas in American approach, they prefer doing an ICSI treatment where the sperms are completely washed and a single sperm is selected and injected into the oocyte. So these are the two different schools of thought, where American approach prefers that since it's already a washed sperms, taking single sperm and injecting, the risk of transmission to the mother will decrease. Whereas in European approach, they say that what if the single sperm is having an HIV inside that? So you are forcefully injecting an HIV sperm into the oocyte. So better go with IUI where natural fertilization will happen and the chances of me forcefully injecting a HIV sperm into the egg will decrease. So these are the different approaches. So each have their own schools of thought, and they endorse it. The last option is for adoption. So if the husband is HIV positive and the patient is subfertile, you can offer either IUI or ICSI depending upon the cause of infertility. Or if the patient is having normal fertility and disagrees for ERT, then you have to offer post-exposure prophylaxis and a timed intercourse if the patient is having very low viremia. So how we do the sperm washing for HIV positive patient? If the husband is infected, we use double density gradient wash, where the semen is taken and it is subjected to about 1600 RPM spinning for 30 minutes. The pellet is taken and it is resuspended into the media, and again a second wash of 1600 RPM for 10 minutes is given. The pellet is resuspended and allowed for a swim up technique for about 1 hour. So the superficial aliquot is taken about 1 ml, so 0.5 ml, which is mixed with 0.5 ml of media. Half is given for testing of HIV RNA PCR, and if it is found to be negative, the rest of the half can be used for IUI or ERT. So the drawback with us is that we don't have this testing of HIV RNA PCR available immediately. That's the reason we offer generally AID treatment for HIV discordant couple. So the sperm washing, almost more than 99% of HIV is removed. Virological testing for sperm fraction for HIV HCV by PCR can be done. In some centers in USA, UK, if the man is having a stable HIV disease for at least 6 months with a viral load less than 50,000 copies per milliliter, or if CD4 count is more than 250, they offer IUI with husband sperms after testing with the PCR. Now, the important caution we have to take is that although we are doing these IUI by washing, we should make sure that there is no trauma to the cervix or to the vagina, which can actually lacerate the mucosa and further increases the chance. Amniocentesis procedure, a commonly recommended procedure for women more than 35 years, again carries a risk of viral transmission to the fetus, so hence should be considered with caution. Coming to other infection, hepatitis B or C. So hepatitis B, the plus point is there is vaccination available. Almost more than 90% protection is offered after 3 doses of vaccination. Precautions should be taken in order to prevent transmission to in the lab. However, there is no vaccine available for HCV. So generally, if the mother is an HPSAG infected, pregnancy does not have any influence. Infection has no adverse effect on pregnancy. In order to determine the chances of transmission, we have to do hepatitis B surface antigen, antibodies, hepatitis envelope antigen, anti-hepatitis E envelope antibodies, and the DNA load. Based on these positive or negative status, we have to counsel the patient about the perinatal transmission to the baby. Always the uninfected partner should be vaccinated with 3 doses. We have to check for the vaccination status. If they are immune, then only we have to start doing an IUI treatment or a direct sexual contacts. So the effects of hepatitis B and C infection on ovarian response is controversial. However, infection does not influence pregnancy outcome. Immunoprophylaxis is warranted when a child is born to a HIV positive woman. However, no such immunoprophylaxis is available for hepatitis C. In IVF, the risk of vertical transmission of HBV and HCV is not different from natural pregnancy. Although ICSI is considered safe in male hepatitis B carriers, there is no enough evidence that it is safe for hepatitis B carriers. Why? Because hepatitis B male carriers, we are washing the sperm and then injecting. However, if the female is affected with hepatitis B, there is no washing technique available for oocytes. So there is always a possibility that this HBV virus can get incorporated into maternal genome. So that's the reason we don't have enough evidence like how safe it is for the hepatitis B carriers, that is the female carriers. So generally how we proceed with the treatment, if the husband is positive, then we do the immunoprophylaxis to female, wait for her to develop that immunity and then start with IUI treatment or IVF treatment. If the female is positive and husband is negative, start the immunoprophylaxis for husband. However, we need not wait because in IUI and in IVF, the husband just produces a sample which will be washed and anyways in there. So the risk is higher here because the female is positive and there is a chance of the DNA getting integrated into the embryo and which can have a vertical transmission later. So this counseling has to be given. However, most studies have told that 1 or 2 positive cases through vertical transmission, and soon after the baby is born with immunoprophylaxis and vaccinations, they have found to be negative by 2 years of their age. So coming to another comorbid condition, that is diabetes, which we commonly come across. So in diabetic patients, we always start with preconceptional folic acid. Our target HbA1c should be less than 7. We should always switch over to insulin when we are giving an active ERT treatment and embryo transfer. And in order to prevent aggregation of diabetes and further complications associated with diabetes, it's always better the patient has single embryo transfer. So women with type 1 diabetes are less fertile and offsprings have an increased risk of congenital malformations, especially when HbA1c is 6.9 and around. Tight pre-IVF control of glucose can reduce this risk of malformations and also normalize the response to ovarian stimulation. And hence it is preferred that the patient is on insulin treatment during ovarian stimulation and embryo transfer. Coming to hypertension, well-controlled hypertension is important during ART and embryo transfer. We should switch over to safer drugs, that is nifedipine, methyl-dopa, labetalol, whose safety profile is well established during pregnancy.
Dear doctors, kindly mute yourself. Dr. Shamsnoor. Luda. Sorry, ma'am. Please go ahead, ma'am.
So I'm not getting into much details because again we are dealing with thyroid infertility and SLE infertility, autoimmune infertility separately. So this is just an overview of how comorbid conditions will be there and the salient features, how it is dealt. Coming to thyroid disorders, all infertile couples should be screened for TSH, and there are many institutes which have incorporated a thyroid antibody profile also, irrespective of the thyroid status of the female patient. So we always routinely check thyroid antibody profile and TSH for all patients. If the thyroid is found to be elevated, patient should be put on thyroid treatment. And if the patient is having high anti-TPOs, then you should monitor the thyroid levels more frequently because these patients require higher doses. And also with controlled ovarian stimulation and pregnancy, there is a chance of further increase in the requirement of thyroid levels, and hence it is important for us to know this thyroid antibodies so as to adjust the dose. If the patient is found to be anti-TPO negative, then she will be just screened once in 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and thyroid dose will be adjusted accordingly. And if the patient is found to be hyperthyroid, then appropriate antithyroids and surgery can be considered. So the normal thyroid function is important. Hypothyroidism is associated with menstrual disorders, infertility, mainly increased risk of miscarriage and complications of pregnancy. So with hypothyroidism, there is decreased libido, failure to ovulation. The patients who are hypothyroid who incidentally conceive have a more chance of pregnancy wastage. Ovulation and conception can occur in mild hypothyroidism, but there is association of increased chances of first trimester abortion, stillbirths, and prematurity. And gestational hypertension often occurs in pregnant with untreated hypothyroidism. It also decreases the rates of metabolic clearance of androstenedione and estrone and increases in the peripheral aromatization. The binding activity of sex hormones binding globulin in plasma is decreased, with the resultant that plasma concentration of both testosterone and estradiol is decreased and their unbound fractions are increased. So this is why it is explained that when we are checking a thyroid, especially during an ERT stimulation and the patients who are on HRT, because of all these variations in their aromatizations, in their unbound fractions, and in the sex hormone binding globulins, your thyroid fluctuates a lot. There is the TSH increases and their requirements also increases. So it is important that we be prepared and actually maintain the TSH on a lower side for patients who are undergoing ERT and embryo transfer. So menstrual cycle abnormality, menorrhagia is commonly seen. Patients with hypothyroid have decreased metabolic thirst. It's the same repetition, and also they have an altered production of coagulation factors. So we should always make sure that the TSH is maintained less than 2.5, because the studies have found that those who are having untreated thyroid or those who are having higher TSH levels have a chance of significantly producing lower quality oocytes and lesser chances of fertilization when compared to euthyroid patients. And autoimmune thyroiditis, it is something which is prevalent about 5 to 15% of infertile patients, and there is an increased prevalence in infertile women due to an effect of it has an effect on estrogen, genetic or X chromosomal abnormalities. So, what is the significance of subclinical thyroid dysfunction and autoimmune this one? So, we can see that the patient is having subclinical thyroid. So, we think that it is not so important and maintain a really low doses of thyroid hormone, but the patient is also having an increased autoimmunity like high anti-TPO, high anti-thyroglobulin antibodies. So we can see in many patients that although the thyroid is well controlled, because of these high antibody levels, these patients have an increased risk of preeclampsia, prenatal morbidity, and also recurrent miscarriages. So sometimes we even consider giving an immunosuppression for such patients in order to prevent this pregnancy wastages. So the target is to maintain TSH below 2.5, especially in patients who are having autoimmune thyroiditis. So this is the same summary here. Then coming to hyperprolactinemia. So we know that hyperprolactin levels it interrupts a normal follicular development. It can actually cause atresia of a dominant follicle. It inhibits the aromatase enzyme, thereby affecting steroidogenesis. It inhibits progesterone synthesis in corpus luteum. It causes premature destruction of corpus luteum and can induce uterine adenomyosis. So this is the reason whenever we see a slightly elevated prolactin levels, it's always better to treat this before we proceed into any sort of treatment, be a natural cycle or an IUI or an ART treatment. And hyperprolactinemia, it inhibits the GnRH activity by interacting with the hypothalamic dopamine and opioid system via a short loop feedback system. So the animal studies revealed that prolactin can act as a potential inhibitor of LH-mediated androgen synthesis. Since androgen serves as a substrate for estrogen production, there can be a hypoestrogenic state with hyperprolactinemia. And high affinity of prolactin receptors has been demonstrated on the surface of granulosa cells. These cells contains the aromatase enzyme. So FSH induces aromatase enzyme activity. So this effect is blocked by the presence of high prolactin levels in the granulosa cells and thereby inhibits a normal follicular development. Prolactin is also involved in induction of LH receptors in order to maintain progesterone synthesis, and it is also necessary in normal levels in order to complete luteinization. However, if the LH prolactin levels are high in the early follicular phase, it can inhibit the progesterone secretion. So samples of follicular fluid obtained from a mature follicles contain lower prolactin concentrations when approximating those that which are found in the serum. Those who are having higher prolactin levels in the fluid, highest prolactin levels occur in fluid of a small follicle, reaching about 5 to 6 fold greater than in that of the serum. So if the follicle exceeds 100 nanogram per ml of prolactin levels, there is a chance that 100% of these follicles will be atretic. So that is the reason IVF stimulation in high prolactin levels is not advisable, because there is a possibility that the follicles are growing but they will be atretic. So we might assume that we don't require a progesterone synthesis because we are not going to do a embryo transfer, or we are supplementing an external gonadotrophin, so actually a folliculogenesis can continue. No, because the prolactins are occupying the receptors in the granulosa cells, and higher these prolactin levels are found in the follicular fluid, there is a chance that the follicle will undergo atresia. So that is the reason it's always better to defer an IVF stimulation in hyperprolactinemia patients. And incidentally, prolactin levels are found to be elevated in about 90 to 50% of women with polycystic ovarian syndrome. Bromocriptine treatment for hypoprolactinemia patients with PCO usually reduces the testosterone levels and LH levels, which can result in resumption of ovulatory cycles. So I think all these things are dealt in other classes. Prolactin should be always measured on empty stomach after some rest, preferably at 6 to 8 a.m. in the morning. 30% of infertile women suffer from hyperprolactinemia, and it is one of the most common hormonal assessments which we do. Single measurement, it gives a poor insight about the real biological value, as it has a peaks during stress, nocturnal peaks are noted, short half-life is also noted. So the protocol being, you should be awake for at least 2 hours before extraction of blood for prolactin without any physical discomfort. High protein diet before the day of extraction should be avoided. High fat diet should be avoided. Avoid breast stimulation. There should be 8 to 10 hours of fasting prior to extraction of blood. There should not be any medications which the patient is on which can decrease or increase the prolactin levels, and the patient should be at rest for half an hour before we extract for prolactin without any undue stress. So how do we manage High prolactin, if the prolactin levels are less than 50, you just follow it by, can treat it and follow it on an yearly basis. If the prolactin levels is somewhere between 40 to 100, we have to test thyroid also, because increased TRH can also causes increase in TSH, which can result in hypothyroidism. If the TSH is found to be abnormal, treat it automatically, PRL levels will also decrease. If TSH is found to be normal, then because the prolactin levels are high, it's always better to do a X-ray of cone view cella. And if it is found to be normal, just prolactin is yearly monitored. If it is found to be abnormal, then go ahead with an MRI to rule out prolactinemias. So we will be under the concept that only if the prolactin levels are more than 100 or 200, we have to monitor for, we have to look for prolactinemias. No, even if the patient is having persistently somewhere between 40 to 100, you are treating with cabergoline, but it is coming back to higher levels later, it's always better to do MRI to rule out microprolactinemias. And if the patient's level is more than 100, then definitely, or if the patient is symptomatic even with the lower prolactin levels, it's better to do my MRI to rule out microprolactinemias. So prolactin serum concentration is directly related to the size of the adenoma. Less than 1 centimeter, we generally see around 200 levels, 1 to 2 centimeter, 200 to 1000. And if your prolactin levels are more than 1000, generally we see an adenoma of more than 2 centimeter. So we have to keep in mind something called an hook effect, where actually the prolactin levels are very high, but because such assays are not available, they are not able to detect it, and they actually give a false lower levels of prolactinemias. So whenever the patient is having a macroadenoma, you have to keep this hook effect in mind while treating for macroadenomas. Coming to management, in group 1, it's an idiopathic or a microadenoma associated hyperprolactinemia. We can manage in medically alone. So the patient is having microadenoma associated with hyperprolactinemia. So this can be treated with drugs. So if the patient is having hyperprolactinemia with macroadenoma, then it needs to be managed with a combination of surgery and radiotherapy or drugs. In miscellaneous group, where hyperprolactinemia is because of systemic disorders, be it drugs, be it because of pituitary hypersecretions of other adenomas, or a HPO axis stalk damage, then we have to treat the underlying disease in order to bring back the prolactin to normal levels. So we commonly come across all three categories of patients. Now, the most commonest drug which we use is, you can go through the slides of different agents. So the commonest drug which we use is cabergoline, which is highly efficacious, has a lower frequency of adverse effects, and it is indicated in patients who are having bromocriptine resistance or intolerance. And the experience during early pregnancy usage is quite limited. The dose is 0.5 mg once a week or twice a week. And if it is a only hyperprolactinemia, we generally give 4 or 6 doses depending on the prolactin levels. If it is associated with microadenomas, then the cabergoline is continued till the patient is able to achieve pregnancy, or up to 1 year of treatment till the microadenoma subsides. And once the pregnancy is achieved, it is advised to stop the cabergoline, as we have limited studies of its effect during pregnancy. So pituitary lesion, patient desirous of a pregnancy, if it is microadenoma, start with cabergoline. And once you achieve a normal prolactin levels, you can start trying for an ART or a pregnancy, and stop the treatment as soon as the pregnancy is achieved. If the patient has macroadenoma, then you can consider transsphenoidal surgery. Cabergoline should be continued throughout the pregnancy if the patient is macroadenoma, and HRT if there is hypogonadism or an expectant management if the patient is not desirous of a pregnancy. So when to stop, therapy may be tapered or discontinued. Patients who have had a treated with dopamine agonist for at least 2 years, if they have normal prolactin levels and no visible treatment remnant tumor on MRI. So normally it is given for 2 years till the prolactin levels are normal and there is no visible lesion on the MRI. Otherwise, for patients with microadenomas, we stop once the pregnancy is achieved and then we have to follow it up later. Coming to seizure disorders, so the special considerations in women who are affected with epilepsy is their sexuality, mood disorders, menstrual cycle irregularities, hormonal contraception, because there is a lot of drug interactions which will happen between this HRT, hormonal contraception, and the epileptic drugs, fertility, bone health, pregnancy, and breastfeeding. So the reproductive dysfunction, lower rates of childbearing and fertility is seen in patients with having epilepsy who are having associated PCOD, hypothalamic amenorrhea, hyperprolactinemia, and premature ovarian failure. So why is that seizure causes subfertility or infertility? So seizures, they from temporal lobe, they disrupt the HPO axis, which interferes with the GnRH pulsatility and hence cause irregularity in the menstruation and ovulation. Anti-epileptic drugs are also known to cause abnormal sex hormone levels, which can induce liver enzymes. Long-term valproate administration is associated with hyperandrogenism, menstrual abnormalities, and PCOD. So secondary endocrinal complications of anti-epileptic treatment include weight changes and changes in insulin sensitivity. In men, it can alter sexuality. There is altered testosterone metabolism, reduced testicular volume, reduced sperm concentration, motility, and morphology. So what is catamenial seizures? Because of the hormonal fluctuations which will happen throughout the menstrual cycle or during menarche, the patient has a predisposition for seizures, which is related to their menstrual cycle. So this is seen about 30 to 50% of epileptic forms in women. The vulnerability of seizures will be highest just before and during the flow of menstruation, and again at ovulation because of relatively higher estrogen and lower progesterone levels. So such patients, it's better to increase the anti-epileptic drugs dosages premenstrually in order to prevent catamenial seizures. So the preconceptional counseling includes the chances of increased risk seizure frequency because of IVF, because of HRT and pregnancy, and the possibility of anticonvulsant therapy and its effects on pregnancy. There is an increased risk of hormonal contraception failure because of an induction in the liver enzymes. It should be placed on a anticonvulsant monotherapy, which the lowest effective dose to control the seizure. So whenever a patient is planning a pregnancy or an IVF treatment, preferably she should be on a single monotherapy, seizure free for at least 6 to 12 months with the minimal possible dose. And you should always initiate folic acid supplementation at least 4 milligram per day 1 month prior to conception. And if you are considering withdrawal of an anti-seizure treatment, then the patient should be seizure free for at least 2 years before you are going ahead with pregnancy. So 6 months after the planned withdrawal. So the overall rate of congenital malformation is about 2 to 3% higher than the background risk. So it stands at 4 to 9%. The risk is higher if the patient is on multiple drug therapy. Plasma levels of AED may fall during pregnancy and hence result in a loss of seizure control. So this is something we have to keep in mind and increase the dose according to trimester of pregnancy. There is no studies concerning effect of IVF as such on seizure frequency. So estrogen is epileptogenic and progesterone has anticonvulsant action. So since the IVF is an estrogen dependent thing, it's always better to keep and increase the dose of anti-epileptic drug during IVF stimulation and pregnancy. So we know that commonly we use this lamotrigine, levetiracetamide for epilepsy during pregnancy. These are category C drugs where the benefits are more when compared to risks. All other drugs like valproate, carbamazepine, phenobarbital and all are contraindicated during pregnancy. So generally, we take help of a physician when we are dealing with diabetes, hypertension, thyroid disorders, prolactin disorders and all. So the most interesting of all these disorders is lupus, where physicians are not much aware like how it has an effect on pregnancy, on an ART treatment. And first of all, diagnosis will be all usually late, or sometimes we miss this diagnosis only to find out that the patient is a lupus patient during the IVF stimulation following a complication. So always keep in mind about systemic lupus erythematosus, that is SLE, in patients. They affect about 1.5% of women. So there is all possibility that we see such patients during our practice of IVF. So it affects about 1.5% of women, which is a chronic inflammatory multi-system disorder. It has multiple associated immunological abnormalities. The patient may present to us in remission phase or an exacerbation phase. If the patient has presented in remission phase, we never diagnose such, only to get back the patient in an exacerbation state during an IVF treatment. These patients have an associated hypertension, renal, and skin manifestations, and generally treated with alkalizing immunosuppressants, NSAIDs, antimalarials, and glucocorticoids. So fertility is normal in SLE except associated amenorrhea accompanying severe flares, renal insufficiency related subfertility, and ovarian failure secondary to cyclophosphamide therapy. So how do we diagnose an SLE? So there are clinical criteria and immunological criteria. At least 4 or more criteria should be fulfilled for us to call the patient as SLE. One should be one at least from clinical, one at least from laboratory. So there are 11 clinical criteria: acute cutaneous lupus, chronic cutaneous lupus, oral ulcers, non-scarring alopecia, arthritis, serositis, renal, neurological, hematological disorders, leukopenia, and thrombocytopenia. So you see that none of these disorders we generally can diagnose by just asking. So not many patients will show that malar rash and all. Not many patients report an arthritis to us when we are taking a history of an infertility. So that is the reason all infertility patients, you should have immunological things in my mind and ask for all these clinical criteria if the patient has suffered, because leukopenia, thrombocytopenia is something the patient will not be able to report by herself. Hemolytic anemia, there will be history of blood transfusions and all. Again, the patient will tell that it was just because of low hemoglobin or something. So that is the reason. Keep this in mind while extracting history for all infertility patients. Immunological criteria: ANA, anti-DNA, anti-Smith, anti-phospholipid antibodies, low complements, direct Coombs test. So these are some of the criteria to diagnose SLE. At 4 or more should be fulfilled. So what is the challenge of SLE during pregnancy or ART? Ovarian stimulation, you know that SLE patients are all at increased risk of thromboembolism. And when we are doing an ART or an HRT or a pregnancy, there is increased levels of estrogen, which itself is an increased risk of thrombosis. So per se, a healthy individual itself will be having an increased risk of thromboembolism following IVF stimulation of pregnancy, which gets aggravated if the patient is having an associated SLE. And thrombosis often occurs in context to an overt ovarian hyperstimulation. And if the patient happens to have a flare during our IVF stimulation, again, it increases the chances. So we should always avoid offering IVF for patients who are manifesting with acute flares, those who are having renal manifestations like renal manifestations, or those who are having vascular manifestations in the form of arterial hypertension and pulmonary hypertension, severe heart diseases like valvular disorders, and previous major thrombotic events. So all these patients should be denied of an ART treatment. So when can you actually consider doing an ovarian stimulation for SLE patients? The contraindications being an acute flare. So at least 6 to 12 months following an acute flare, you should avoid an IVF stimulation. Badly controlled arterial stimulation, arterial hypertension, pulmonary hypertension, renal disease, valvulopathy, previous history of thrombotic event, and the risk of, and there is an anti-phospholipid antibody positive or an anti-Rho or anti-La antibodies. So these are the patients who should be always discouraged to undergo an IVF treatment, because these are the patients who are at a very high risk of thromboembolic episodes, which can result to stroke also and organ failures and death. So if we are considering an SLE patient to be taken up for an IVF treatment, the disease should be silent for at least 6 months. So the patient should be in a remission state for at least 6 months. She should not have any arterial manifestations, no pulmonary hypertension, no arterial hypertension. The urine analysis should be normal. Her renal function test, kidney function test should be normal. We should always rule out pulmonary hypertension before we take up for ART. Now, in spite the patient is on a remission phase, she is not having any manifestation in any of her systems. It's important that we keep her estrogen level at low as much as possible, because this is the triggering factor for thromboembolic episode. So always discourage doing an aggressive IVF stimulation. Use minimum gonadotropin dose. Avoid high E2 levels. That's the reason we should go for a mild stimulation. Use anti-estrogenic drugs. Like clomiphene citrate, aromatase inhibitors, which keeps the estrogen levels low. Avoid OHSS and multiple pregnancy, because multiple pregnancy again leads to increased estrogen levels. Now, during an IVF stimulation, we always start the patient with low molecular weight heparin, 40 to 60 mg, depending upon the body weight of the patient. And this should be stopped about 12 to 24 hours prior to oocyte retrieval, and restarted as early as 6 hours to 12 hours, depending upon the risk associated. Always do a single embryo transfer. Luteal phase support should be given in the form of natural progesterone through a non-oral route in order to avoid first pass. So the guideline for ovarian stimulation in women with SLE or antiphospholipid syndrome, there should be a friendly ovarian stimulation. Clomiphene citrate and aromatase inhibitors are the drug of choice. Prevent OHSS, single embryo transfer, coadjuvant therapy with anticoagulation. You can also consider use of corticosteroids and other immunosuppressants, depending on usually these immunologists will put the patient on immunosuppressants like HCQs or Vislon therapies in order to prevent this flare or the patient getting to a relapse state. So this coadjuvant therapy, it's very important that the patient is on to prevent this relapses. And transfer the frozen embryos in a natural cycle is better than a treated cycle. So better do the embryo transfer in a natural cycle where there is a dominant follicle and the endometrium is ready. Or if at all, if you have to go for a modified natural, it's better to use natural estrogen over the synthetic estrogens. Transdermal routes are better because there they have lesser chances of thromboembolism. Luteal phase support in the form of vaginal routes of micronized progesterones are preferred. Avoid using HCGs as they have an effect on the coagulation cascade. Excuse me. So prophylactic therapy, anticoagulants to prevent thrombosis, corticosteroids or immunosuppressants in order to prevent lupus activity during ovarian stimulation. And again, after a pregnancy is achieved, there is always a chance of preeclampsia, placental infarctions, fetal death, prematurity, and also we have to continue the thrombosis prophylaxis and the immunosuppressant prophylaxis throughout pregnancy. So thromboembolic disorders like APLA and all again have finally the end effect is the same, that is thromboembolism, which can result in organ failure and strokes. So the prophylaxis is the same for patients who have known thromboembolic disorders also. So who are these patients? Patients who are actually have a high risk for thrombotic episodes during IVF, those who are already having history of DVT or pulmonary embolism prior to IVF, thrombophilia diagnosed as a part of a fertility workup, family history, smokers, hyperhomocystinemia, superovulation with raised plasma estrogen may produce an hypercoagulable state, although the studies during IVF are quite reassuring. So whenever we know that many a times as a fertility workup, we do this thrombophilia, those who are having recurrent pregnancy loss, APLA profile workup and all. So anybody who is found to be positive in these, or who are smokers, or who are having family histories, or who have actually previously suffered from thromboembolic disorders, will be at high risk. So most commonly we come across APLA positive patients who are undergoing IVF because they will be having subfertility or infertility. So for the patient to be called as an APLA, you should have one clinical, one laboratory criteria to be fulfilled. In clinical criteria, history of vascular thrombosis, or quite often we see a pregnancy morbidity where the patient had one loss after 10 weeks of pregnancy, or 3 consecutive unexplained losses less than 10 weeks of pregnancy, or one premature delivery attributed to either eclampsia or a severe preeclampsia or a placental insufficiency. Coming to laboratory criteria, it might be a lupus positive or a beta 2 glycoprotein or anti-cardiolipin antibodies positive. So it's important that it should be done on 2 occasions, at least 2 weeks apart. Both should show positive status. Then only it means that the laboratory criteria is fulfilled. So what are the complications? As I said, thromboembolism DVT is after IVF is rare but a serious complication seen in patients with thromboembolic disorders. There is a considerable change in coagulation and fibrinolytic system during IVF stimulation, especially following administration of HCG. So this is the reason it has to be kept in mind and keep the E2 levels low and keep the appropriate thromboprophylaxis. And preconceptional counseling should include the risk of fetal loss, both early and late, increased risk of PIH and HELP syndrome, risk of thrombosis, both arterial and venous, the need of anticoagulation, the chances of baby being small for gestation or fetal growth restrictions due to placental insufficiency, likelihood of preterm delivery. So if the patient is having thrombophilia, all IVF patients should undergo an individual risk assessment. Low dose gonadotropin is preferred. Coasting, cycle cancellation, and freeze-all should be considered if there is over response. Give an agonist trigger. Use low dose aspirin and low dose low molecular weight heparin and compression stockings during IVF stimulations. And thromboprophylaxis is must for patients who are having previous DVT, those who have developed OHSS, and those with thrombophilia. And low molecular weight heparin should be continued till 24 hours before retrieval and continued after the retrieval with continuation of compression stockings. This low molecular weight heparin should be continued throughout first trimester and extended even after that, depending upon the placental status. So the treatment, if the patient is having SLE but no APLA, anticoagulation is not recommended. We can use anti-inflammatory like corticosteroids or immunosuppressants to be introduced or increased. If the patient is having APLA positive, then heparin prophylactic dose should be initiated. The use of aspirin is unproven, but we still use it in order to prevent arterial thrombosis. Then if the patient is having APLA and there is history of thrombosis, warfarin is switched to heparin therapeutic dose before ovarian stimulation. Heparin should be stopped 12 to 24 hours before retrieval and restarted 6 to 12 hours after. Heparin should be continued throughout the pregnancy, and low dose aspirin is added for those patients with history of thrombosis. So we have to stop this aspirin at least 3 to 4 days before the oocyte retrieval. Coming to renal failure and infertility, anovulation is common with chronic renal failure. Restoration of normal cycle can be seen in patients with transplantation. So there is no increased abnormalities after exposure to cyclosporin from conception. So we know that all these transplant patients will be put on some immunosuppressants in order to prevent graft rejection. So there is no such increase in the abnormality after exposure to cyclosporin. There is also a reassuring data about tacrolimus and Neoral, which is given following renal transplants. So can we offer IVF for renal transplant patient? Yes, if the patient is having a stable transplant with normal creatinine levels of 1.4, at least 2 years post renal transplant, then only she can be considered for IVF treatment. It is important we switch over from mycophenol MMF to azathioprine at least 3 months prior to IVF. This MMF is again given in order to prevent graft rejection following renal transplant, and the patient will be continued on this there is complete till 2 years of transplant. So when we are considering for a post transplant IVF therapy, it has to be switched over to azathioprine, which is safe. And most renal transplant patients are also hypertensive patients, so it's important that we do a modification in the antihypertensive therapy, especially because most patients are on ACE inhibitors, and switch over to a more safe medications. Transvaginal oocyte collection is not a challenge even if it is a presence of a pelvic kidney. We should make sure that OHSS is completely avoided, as there is a risk of impairment of transplanted kidneys in its function. Single embryo transfer is always preferred in renal transplant patient. So these patients are at an increased risk of miscarriage, hypertension, and PIH. IUGR, PROM, 44% of neonates have a good birth weight. However, still premature delivery, stillbirth risk is more. So the mothers can also suffer from recurrent UTI and hydronephrosis, which, however, has no increased risk of graft rejection. So coming to obese patient, they are categorized into normal weight, pre-obese, and obese based on their BMI. The concerns of obesity with respect to their reproductive disorders, they have an increased risk of type 2 diabetes, cholestasis, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, ischemic heart disease, arthritis, thromboembolism, asthma, which can indirectly affect their reproductive function by causing menstrual irregularities, anovulation, subfertility, and increased risk of miscarriage. So the adverse effect of obstetrics and perinatal associated with obesity are maternal hypertension, PIH, increased risk of gestational diabetes, venous thromboembolism, macrosemia, and shoulder dystocia, increased chances of IUDs, increased rates of cesarean section and surgical complications, postnatal respiratory complications. To the baby, there is increased risk of neural tube defects, omphalocele, cardiac defects, ophthalmic defects, urogenital and limb defects. And when it comes to obesity, again, during IVF stimulation, we make sure that the patient loses weight, has appropriate thromboembolus prophylaxis. We require higher doses of stimulation in order to obtain normal response in these patients. So they have an increased requirement of gonadotropins, longer duration of stimulation. There are fewer oocytes and lesser embryos when compared to normal weight patients. The obesity has an effect on the follicular growth and endocrinology, endometrial growth and implantation. So all obese patients, especially those associated with PCO, have an increased risk of miscarriage and pregnancy complications. So should we offer ERT for obese men? Yes, after a careful antenatal and intrapartal care, obese women should be always informed about their possibility of increased medical risk, increased risk of failures, increased risk of thromboembolic disorders. After an appropriate counseling only, these patients should be offered ERT. Non-fertile obese women can conceive frequently. Weight loss programs usually have poor results. So whenever we are offering ERT for obese patients, so all these counselings, because these patients will not be aware that possibility is that they might be expecting an IVF failure, but they will not be knowing about the risks associated with stimulation, especially that which is associated with this thromboembolic disorders. So this has to be properly counseled before you take up these patients for an ERT treatment. So the common disorders now discussed. So the treatment of choice for hypertension is labetalol and nifedipine. For diabetes, switching over to insulin and metformin is best. Patients who are on for depression, they should avoid SSRIs. Epilepsy, lamotrigine, levetiracetamine, gabapentin is the preferred drug of choice. Autoimmune disorders, they should be put on cyclosporin, tacrolimus, azathioprins, and systemic steroids. Then antivirals like acyclovir, zidovudine, neviprine are considered safe during pregnancy. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaitra ma'am.
Thank you. Any doubts they can ask?
Doctors, any doubts to clarify?